Good morning,
everyone.
Delighted to be with you this morning. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and I welcome you to today's discussion. This is the second event in a series of 3 Rural Ideas Fora hosted by my department, inviting people to come together and discuss some of the key challenges and opportunities facing rural Ireland. These events are an important objective in the government's rural development policy or rural future. A very ambitious policy for rural Ireland, and one which is already having a positive impact in communities, towns and villages across the country. Ongoing engagement with our rural stakeholders and citizens, and providing them with the opportunity to exchange ideas, is an important part in our efforts to make rural Ireland a better place to live. I understand there's been great demand to register for today's event, which clearly shows the huge interest there is in this topic and a great endorsement of this type of event as well. So today we're discussing the transition to a climate neutral society with a particular focus on its relevance to rural Ireland. This is an exceptionally timely event with the publication of the Climate Change Advisory Council's report earlier this week and the upcoming Climate Action Plan. Globally, I think it's fair to say that climate change and our response to it is the most significant issue of our generation and indeed future generations. And for me personally, it was a key reason why I got involved in politics in the first place. When it comes to the prospect that climate change is bringing, I feel it's important not to equivocate. The way societies and economies are fundamentally organised in developed countries, including Ireland, is frankly slowly but surely killing the planet. Climate change is already having a visible impact around the world and indeed in Ireland too. We must take action to respond to the climate crisis and create a sustainable future. At the same time, recognising that although climate action is relevant across our nation, it has very specific effects on our rural areas and the people who live there. I grew up on a small farm in rural County Cork, and I'm acutely aware of the intrinsic part that agriculture plays, not just in rural economies, but in the very fabric of rural communities, and in particular in the manner in which young people try to envisage a future for themselves in rural Ireland. The very character of our country and how we define ourselves as a nation is, in my view, very tightly linked to the vibrancy of rural Ireland. And today, let me attempt to reassure those in rural Ireland who are worried about how potential changes to agriculture might negatively impact them and their future prospects. Agriculture can, must, and will, I believe, continue to form the basis of not just a viable future in rural Ireland for families and communities, but a vibrant and truly sustainable prospect long into the future. Now, it's not just me saying this. Earlier this year in Mayo, in Cork and Wexford, yesterday in Sligo, I visited farms where farmers have embraced climate-friendly methods, and these are practices that are spreading and improving all the time. Our rural future has a vision for a thriving rural Ireland, which is underpinned by a commitment to economic, social and environmental sustainability. Our ambition is to achieve a just transition for all, including rural communities, and we acknowledge that rural communities will need supports to help them in this transition. Through working closely with and supporting rural communities and businesses, we aim to maximise the opportunities which exist for them to contribute to meeting our national climate targets. But this isn't just a question of targets, it's very much a question of seizing opportunities to improve the well-being and quality of life in rural areas. Sectors such as renewable energy generation, smart farming, retrofitting, green technologies and the circular economy offer huge economic potential in addition to their obvious environmental benefits. And some examples from the government's commitments to assist communities in the transition to a climate neutral economy are outlined in our rural future, and these include supporting employment opportunities for rural communities in sustainable tourism, in the bioeconomy and the social and circular economy. Reaching the target of generating at least 70% of electricity through renewables by 2030, partly through local community supports. The new Renewable Electricity Support Scheme is critical in empowering our communities to participate in energy generation. There's also a plan to expand the Sustainable Energy Communities Network to involve more local communities directly, and in investing in peatland rehabilitation to contribute to reduce carbon emissions, carbon sequestration and enhance biodiversity, but again also economic opportunity. I have the honour of being the Minister of State for Community Development, and particularly since restrictions have eased and we've been able to meet people face to face, I've seen, I've heard and I've felt the strength of community spirit in rural Ireland through the variety of groups and organisations that the Department of Rural and Community Development and the Department of Social Protection support. There is great strength and opportunity in rural Ireland, and I think COVID in many ways has helped us to value rural Ireland more. It has helped us to see how rural Ireland is going to be an integral part of Ireland as a whole moving forward. We value the natural world more. We see the possibilities that remote working opens up for us and how our quality of life as a whole can be improved by investing in rural Ireland. I'm delighted to confirm that there will be specific supports and opportunities for the community and voluntary sector as part of the Community Climate Action Plan. And Dr. Rob Mooney from the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications will touch on these later. In conclusion, I'm really pleased that this event is taking place. I'm very sorry that I can't be there for the whole event, as it's clashing with a two-day trip I'm on in Sligo and Leitrim. So I'm speaking from an office in Carrigan-Shannon at the moment, and I've got meetings set up around Leitrim for the day. But I will be getting a report back on the event today, and I very much look forward to hearing the insights and the perspectives of the speakers that are joining us today, but particularly the views of all those in attendance, which will be captured in the session as well. So thank you very much for attending, and enjoy the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister O'Brien, and yeah, for opening this event while currently traveling around the country and working through the different challenges to do that. So with that, as the Minister said, one of the next things we're going to be doing is to hear from Dr. Rob Mooney, and I'll just bring Rob up right now. Yeah, here we are. So I'm delighted to introduce Rob this morning from the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications. So I know that one of your main roles, Rob, is working on the National Dialogue on Climate Action, amongst a number of other things, but that's particularly relevant today. And we're just going to get a chance to really hear some of the context, the view, the strategy on behalf of the department in terms of this challenge of transitioning to climate neutral society and what's needed in the times ahead. So Rob, thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ali, and thank you very much to the Minister for opening the event this morning. So we're delighted to be here, and I would just like to say, sorry, can everybody see my screen? Is that sharing correctly, Ali?
Yeah, that's great.
We're delighted to be here, and I think that this shows a really important collaboration across government between different departments, and the importance of how our transition to a climate neutral society is fundamentally embedded in all our work and will be going forward. What I'd like to do today is just set the scene, and the Minister has touched on many of these issues already, and then talk through really what our plans are going forward and how fundamentally we're going to be engaging people and reaching out to communities. So to set the scene very briefly, the IPCC report has really stated quite categorically and clearly that the planet's climate is transforming the world. The last 4 decades in particular are warmer than any since 1850. This is unprecedented. And we're seeing an increase in more than 1% already in pre-industrial times. The evidence that human influence is warming the planet is beyond dispute, and the risk we face now is that if we end up at 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2060 and possibly 5 degrees by the end of the century if we don't act now. The risks are extensive, and they're direct and indirect. They include rising sea levels, extreme weather that affect our land, coast and seas, pressure on our water resources, food production, impacts on river and coastal ecosystems, poorer quality water. It affects the timing of life cycles for events for plants, animals on the land and in the oceans. In Ireland in particular, we might face the risk of new pests and diseases coming to our country. It would also represent risks for political and security instability, and also the displacement of populations. The Paris Agreement and the 2030 SDGs recognize as well that fundamentally climate change will be felt by all, but that this will be uneven, not only by different countries, but recognizes that different regions and countries are at greater risk. The challenge for Ireland in particular, as laid out in the EPA's climate status report, is that we have a limited window for real action, and that we need to ensure that current and future generations can live sustainably in a low carbon and a climate resilient world. To do this, we need to limit temperature increases to at least 1.5%, to increase the ability to adapt to the impacts of climate change and foster resilience. and also ensure that financial flows remain consistent with climate resilient development. To set the scene then, what's happened in the last few years that's of critical importance to deliver on this. The European Green Deal was published in 2019. This sets out our target of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. This is put into legal obligations through the European Climate Law. And in addition to that, the European Climate Pact, which is an EU-wide initiative, is inviting people, communities and organizations to participate in climate action by sharing knowledge and implementing solutions. So this is at the European level. They're fundamentally recognizing the importance of delivering this collectively. In Ireland, the 2020 programme for government committed Ireland to reducing our carbon emissions by 51% by 2030 and to achieve a net zero by 2050. This has been reflected now in the Climate Action Low Carbon Development Act 2021, which sets this ambition in legislation. The Climate Action Plan, which will shortly be published, sets out very clear pathways on how we're going to achieve this. In Ireland, we're adopting a similar but a specific collaborative approach, which fundamentally recognises that changes in society and economy, including our built environment, energy, transport, waste and agriculture are required, as the Minister has already laid out. This requires a collaborative effort by government, business communities and individuals. It will require changes in individuals' behaviours on how we work, heat our homes, travel, produce our food, consume goods and services and manage our waste. But we are committed, and government are committed to leading on this. But delivering this ambition is fundamentally the responsibility of everyone in society. So that sets the tone for the challenge. Now, I think the latter part of this discussion should really be focused on our opportunities and what we're going to do to deliver this. In 2021, we held a series of climate conversations. We talked to nearly 4,000 people from the public, PPNs, Coilín and Og. We held 70 in-depth interviews. We heard a voice of a public that were responsive to this crisis, feel a sense of urgency around this, are enthusiastic to work with government, agencies and other organizations. It identified areas where people are already making changes, but it also allowed us to identify areas where individuals and communities feel they lack either information, knowledge, resources, or the capacity to pursue these changes. They asked us for joined up thinking to deliver ambitious policies that are reflected where they live. And they also asked us to enhance the capacity of local authorities and the community sector. We have developed, following a pilot in 2017 to 2019, a new national dialogue on climate action. This is going to deliver a systematic means of engaging actively with stakeholders and the public across Ireland to help them deliver on climate action at a local and national level. Our vision is to empower everybody in society to help us reach these targets across three main objectives. The first is to improve climate literacy. And that means creating not just awareness, but promoting an understanding of climate change through communications and education. It involves our primary task, which is funding, supporting and enabling active engagement across society to promote sustainable behaviours. We're also going to be working to capture insights and conducting social and behavioural research to inform us about the impact of our activities, to measure us against our own targets, to ensure that we're delivering effectively in a way that's meaningful for people. As a little indication of some of the activities at the national level, we're going to be hosting a national climate stakeholder forum. We'll be establishing a youth climate assembly. We'll be holding the climate conversations we had this year will be an annual event. We'll be reaching out to a broad range of people to ensure that we stay on track. We'll also be holding climate conferences, lecture series and workshops. At the local level, we'll be providing financial supports, which I'll talk about in a moment, hosting local climate conversations, fundamentally enabling network and capacity building between organizations and communities, and hosting on an annual basis a national climate conversation event. And that's going to bring people from local communities together at a national level to talk about best practice, their experiences, their challenges, and to try and work on the scalability of some of these best practice initiatives. Delivering the NDCA then, as I said, will be built on robust research and evidence. So this will allow us not only as I said, measure the impact of what we're doing and feed back into the climate action plan itself, it'll allow us to identify populations that are most at risk, what challenges they're facing. It'll allow us to target policy supports and engagements and inform sectoral plans in those areas. So we have robust research being delivered through the EPA, but also we're going to, as I said, capture insights from our engagement activities. In terms of funding then, we'll shortly be launching the Climate Action Fund, which is under the Community Climate Action Programme. Now, I don't have a final date for that, but it is coming up in the next few weeks. This is going to be delivered across two key strands. The first is to build low carbon communities, and this will be delivered through the local authorities. The second is to build capacity in communities. So this will be open to a lot of community organizations to promote education, capacity building, and learning by doing. We've already launched the Creative Climate Action Fund, and we've now funded 14 projects that support artists and communities in exploring ways people engage with climate action in a more creative and a more sort of nuanced way, rather than just engaging in activity. The following themes are being focused on, but they're not exclusive. They're home, energy, travel, food waste, shopping, recycling, and then local climate and environmental action. As I promised my colleagues, I wouldn't go through this in a lot of detail because I know we've got a packed agenda today. I wanted just to lay out some of the findings from, or some of the outputs from our work. So ultimately, when we went to talk to people about the climate conversations, we asked them, what are your core priorities? What we've done is we've thematically analysed that, and we've identified the key challenges that they've identified. And we have a comprehensive list beside this and the activities that we're going to be delivering through the Climate Action Plan and through working with our colleagues across government over the next year and on into the future. Some of them include key policies and strategies, obviously primarily the Carbon Budget's Climate Action Plan, but also obviously our Rural Future, Circular Economy, National Remote Working Strategies, etc. We've invested nearly 22 billion through the National Development Plan this year. We're promoting the Climate Action Fund, also grants for vehicles, retrofitting grants, etc. are still in situ. The built environment, we've got serious ambitions for retrofitting dwellings and installing heat pumps. And as I said already, through the public participation piece, we're going to be launching our national dialogue for climate action very shortly, which will fundamentally give the opportunity for everyone in society to engage actively with us. In terms of rural Ireland, there are significant ambitions for the agri-food sector and supports that are going to be put in place, including improvements in farming practices and also exploring new business opportunities. In the land use change and forestry, we're conducting research to explore pathways for long-term sustainable net sinks, balancing the environment, social and economic considerations, as the Minister already identified, and also delivering significant ecosystem services and biodiversity benefits. There's significant ambition in transport that identifies the challenges of rural communities, including decarbonising the public transport, but also looking at the transport infrastructures, supporting walking, cycling and public transport where possible, but also increasing things like biofuel blends for particular industries or sectors that may be harder to electrify. Just transition is at the core of the Climate Action Plan, and you'll see that reflected as soon as it's published shortly. But ultimately, it's supported through a national Just Transition Fund. We'll be promoting reskilling, training and education and enterprise supports to essentially meet these new business requirements, these new initiatives that are going to be promoted, these new challenges and opportunities that are going to be presented. Peat restoration and then retrofitting of local homes are other key deliverables. As we talked about already, we've colleagues here from the Climate Action Regional Authorities. In addition, each local authority will be tasked with developing a climate action plan. So I just wanted to finish off on ultimately, as far as I see, and I think a lot of my colleagues would be in agreement, we recognize the challenge. We recognize that this is a significant step change for everyone in society. But fundamentally, there are core opportunities, and focusing on that allows us to think through the pathway ahead. So this does represent new opportunities in these sustainable industries. Fundamentally, it'll deliver improved water, air, and quality of land for rural and for the rest of our communities. It'll increase biodiversity and ultimately allow us to deliver a climate resilient, robust, and profitable agri-food sector. And I promise my final slide. So our challenge looking forward is that fundamentally, as the Minister has laid out, we need to decarbonise every part of our society. This is our challenge. As we've seen, and the science is telling us, this is a fundamental challenge for all of humanity. It's essential that we work collaboratively to develop solutions and maximise opportunities to co-create this future. The government is committed to a meaningful engagement and dialogue with rural communities, and that's demonstrated by today's event and the strategic approach adopted by the National Dialogue on Climate Action. And thank you very much.
Great, Rob, thank you so much. That was with so much there, and a really clear expression of all the work that's happening, and really sets the stage for the conversation that we're going to go on to have next. So thank you very much, and I will now move into that. I'm sure there's thoughts, reactions that are coming up for others, but what we'd like to do now is move into a panel conversation with some key leaders with great perspectives to share on these very themes, and as Rob alluded to already. So without further ado, I'd like to start to introduce those guests, and just to say, yeah, thanks to John and others. Our thought was to move straight on into the panel, and then we'll have a chance to sort of respond and have a wider conversation after. So yeah, come back to you then. Into introducing our panel, first of all, I would like to really warmly welcome Seamus Boland. So Seamus, CEO of Irish Rural Link, and I know you serve on a number of National Development Plan Monitoring Committees, and sit on the board of Pobble and many other things I'm sure that will come up as you share with us. Also a member of the Carnegie Rural Commission, which examines rural issues in Great Britain and Ireland, and the president of the European Economic and Social Committee Diversity Europe Group. So Seamus, welcome, and thank you for bringing all your experience and leadership to this conversation. And next, I'm really delighted to welcome Claire Downey. So welcome, Claire. And I've been sort of briefed on all the background of our speakers today, but I know Claire is already changing. So Claire is now the Director of Policy and Research at the Rediscovery Centre, as you'll see in her name, as of the last couple of weeks, which builds on her decades of experience in this whole area. I know before you were in Community Resources Network Ireland, or that may still be a connection. And particular, what I'm really looking forward to hearing about is this conversation around the circular economy and everything that you can share with us about that. So thanks so much for being here, Claire. And then finally, our third member of the panel, just make sure I can bring you up here into the speaker's space, is David Mellett. So welcome, David. And as Rob had mentioned, David's the regional coordinator in one of our climate action region offices in the Atlantic Seaboard North, which were established in 2018, I think you said, by the local authority sector. And maybe, David, you'll mention as you're speaking kind of more about, for those that don't know, what you're doing in that role and what your organisation does. But for now, just thank you so much for being here and joining this conversation. So we have our three speakers and myself. I will conduct that and put out some questions that will hopefully lead to a rich conversation for all of us. So maybe to start with then, we've one that we wanted to open with, and maybe we'll just go in the same order. So I'll start with you, Seamus, is just, what does climate transition really represent for you, or for your organisation that you lead? What would you say that represents for you?
I think and thank you very much. And by the way, thanks to the Minister for his excellent opening of this event. I think I welcome it enormously. I think this dialogue needs to happen, and I think that needs to be said because it's really important. For members of Irish Rural Link, there's kind of two strategies that we've pursued as an organisation. One is dealing with the fears and worries of people who know this is coming, who are not climate deniers and are worried, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And secondly, we've been involved in actually delivering and working on subjects, on events that actually help. And I'll give you an example. We assisted the government in managing the peatland strategy, particularly around the peatlands directive. We've worked with communities on the retrofit along with Sustainable Energy Ireland. And we have established a wetlands forum, which looks at the whole area of biodiversity and the aftermath of bogs and all of that. And of course, we're involved in the just transition. So we combine both the actual activities on the ground with representing the fears. And I suppose, Ali, the biggest issue we held an event in Athlone on hotels, Hudson Bay Hotel, and it was quite a very feisty meeting. And at that event, there was a lot of rural dwellers, householders, people worried about climate change, but very worried about how much it would cost the change that they needed to make, whether it was in their households and in their lives and in terms of transport. So those fears are there, and the fears is something I know what the Minister is alluding to, and I welcome it, is these fears have to be managed. And secondly, and then I'll allow you, the other guests, secondly, we did an energy set of webinars during the last year. And I think what came very strongly from those was that communities, in terms of establishing energy cooperatives, were really asking that they be allowed do that. And I think that's part of a bigger conversation around how communities can look at their own area in terms of neutralizing the carbon emission, and then being able to translate that into a kind of local energy cooperative, which I think would be a real game changer in terms of climate change in rural areas. So that's enough for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Seamus. I think the things I'm hearing that are, in terms of what climate transition is meaning from your perspective, is this: there is fear to be worked with. That's a natural aspect, and that's being expressed in our communities. And then secondly, that as communities, there's a desire, if this change is happening, then to lead that change, to actually be the ones leading that change for ourselves. And thank you, Seamus. So moving on to you, Claire, how about for you? What does climate transition mean for you and in your role?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on to this panel. Thanks to the department. Yeah, so I work for the Rediscovery Centre. It's the National Centre for Circular Economy. So our focus is on this transition to a more circular economy. And well, we do that through sort of education, demonstration and research, and hopefully show the real opportunity that's in this space. What we mean by this transition is moving from what we call today's linear economy, so where we extract resources, usually far away, turn them into products, assemble components, make the products, ship them over and sell them. Then we use them and throw them away. So it's a take, make, dispose model. And we want to move away from that to a model where we keep our resources in the economy for as long as we can. We recirculate them, we share, instead of everyone buying a drill, for example, which is only ever used for 15 minutes in its entire lifespan on average, that we share them, you know, that we buy secondhand or sell secondhand. So all of these are examples of circular economy activities. They're much, I suppose, really sort of everyday activities for some people. So the connection with climate here is that these products are all have huge impacts upstream when they're made. So when you mine your primary resources, when you cut down, I suppose, or log wood to make paper and cardboard products, that all feed into the goods that we use every day, the laptop that you're using to access this, or the desk you're sitting at, or the clothes you're wearing, or the food that you eat. And overall, about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the production and distribution of our goods, our building materials, and our food. If you look at it a different way, when we talk about transport emissions, for example, which is kind of the language we use around climate, We're talking about transporting our goods. So if we use less goods, we would be transporting less. If we talk about agricultural emissions, we're talking about food. If we avoid food waste, that's one way to reduce unnecessary emissions. And when we talk about electricity, some of that's used to store our products, to retail them in our stores. So we can't look at, I suppose, circular economy without looking at the whole economy. And that's how it fits in.
Wow, thank you, Claire. I know the term, but I just really got this picture of the alternative to the circular economy, the one that we're kind of in, is this kind of line, the take, make, dispose, you said, and then we kind of fall off a cliff, and then there's this huge mountain of waste rising up and destroying our planet. So yeah, so I hear that it really starting to illuminate for us what that circular economy would mean, and really a change in every aspect of our economy, looking at ways that we can use less. So I'm sure we'll hear more about that, but thank you for that as an opening, setting the scene for us there. And so moving on to you, David, how about for you? What would climate transition mean in your eyes?
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Morning, everyone. So as Ali mentioned at the start, I'm in the Climate Action Regional Office, which is within the local authority sector. And the sector itself has been identified as having a key role to play in helping meet our climate objectives, and particularly on decarbonisation, but also on adaptation, which is the second half of climate action, which is often forgotten about, but is critical, I think, for a small island nation such as ourselves. So the role for the sector, there's probably two elements. There's the internal changes we need to make ourselves as an organisation to be that exemplary role and to also decarbonise our own activities. But also there's the outward one of mobilising and supporting action in the communities. And to help kind of put a framework around that, because it's quite a broad ask of the sector, they have developed or launched a strategy earlier this year with 6 key pillars to it. The first one being that all 28,000 staff within the sector will be mandated to lead on climate action. So we're trying to bring climate action out of the corner office and environment into every function and service within the local authority, and it becomes a foundation of how we do things rather than just an add-on to some of the projects. So that's kind of the leadership part of it, and there's a lot of services and functions provided by the local authorities, so we're trying to leverage that, and particularly some of the spatial planning functions that we have would be one of the stronger ones, and also the community supports as well in the context of today. The second goal then is around our own energy and emission targets. So we're committed to achieving a 50% reduction in our emissions by 2030, as well as retrofitting our social housing stock, which will address some of the fuel poverty and some of the concerns people may have with the rising cost of energy. And within that as well, it will also provide us opportunities to maybe aggregate projects within the community, that we could take the lead on some of our decarbonising projects, but bring in the private sector as well into those projects. The third pillar then is the adaptation side. So we need to adapt our own functions and services, but also help communities build resilience and enterprise as well to be aware of the risks that are coming down the track of them, and put the supports in place to allow them to adapt and build resilience to those impacts that we're expecting from climate change. So the first three are very much the internal side. The latter ones we get into helping mobilise action in the communities by building awareness and putting in supports. Similarly with enterprise, that we put in the supports there, but we also kind of nurture and support the development of new innovations that will be needed to address some of these challenges. And the final one then is the just transition, that all of this happens in a just and fair way, that we bring everyone with us. And I think local authorities are well placed to work with the communities to help identify those vulnerable sectors within the community that will be impacted both from the decarbonising programme, but also from the impacts of climate change itself, that may not have the ability to adapt and build resilience. So quite a broad remit. And the CARAs, as you said, were set up in late 2018 to help build capacity within the sector, primarily looking at the adaptation side, but the ambition within the sector has grown into that larger remit that I've talked about. So we're there to help support and coordinate action and be the link between the local and the national agencies and government departments, and try and link all the funding and supports that are available to where it's needed on the ground.
Wow, thank you, David. Yeah, it does sound like a broad remit, as does all of your roles, and Rob's as well. And I really hear that. It was wonderful to hear about the kind of all the internal, there's a whole half of your set of pillars around the kind of internal, what you're doing within your organizations, and then the outer aspect and supporting our communities. So be good to hear, we'll hear a little bit more about that as we continue. So maybe as a next theme to sort of go into, and I think this came out at the end of Rob's, what Rob shared as well, is just this, you know, an approach that we're taking here, the department is definitely taking, is really in the midst of, you know, many challenges that I think are arising for all of us in a modern society, particularly in rural areas, that it can be missed that there is actually incredible opportunities. And I just wondered whether, you know, what would you each see as being some of the real opportunities, the real positives for a climate transition in rural communities? So, and maybe starting with you again, Seamus. And just to say you're on mute at the moment. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. In turn, first of all, thanks, David. That gave a good outline of what the thinking is, and I think we need to hear more of that, because I think, as I said, the initiatives are, in my opinion, they're not simple, and yet in a way they are. As I said, we're talking about deliberate fears, and yet we haven't mentioned transport. That's a real issue. How do we overcome transport in the rural situations? I'll give you the smallest example going. It's really tiny and it costs very little. Let's just take a simple thing that could have happened in the budget. Let's say the school transport. Okay, we know many cases with rural roads, they're not fit, you know, they're not fit for cycling or anything like that. So to qualify for free transport, you must live outside, I think it's 4.8 kilometers. Okay, now think of it in a morning, on a school morning, parents trying to get kids out to school that need at least 2 cars because one of them may be going to work and all sorts of stuff. You could have done something there about the free transport, because I know of kids walking by or driving by bus stops, but they don't qualify for the free transport. It's a very simple thing, and it would have meant a great deal in terms of bringing confidence to rural householders that, look, we're serious about climate change. We really want more kids going by a bus than cars. That would be a simple thing, but it's bigger than that. It's about, you know, even looking at electric cars in a rural area, how does that work? It's about practical things. And certainly when we talk to members at those events that we held between the energy forums and the retrofit over the last couple of years, what we're hearing is, look, we know the climate change stuff. They even know the literacy stuff and regarding climate change, but what we don't know are the solutions. And I think, you know, that's where we've got to get really simple about solutions that will work. And that's where we've got to do some real thinking.
Wow. Yeah, I'm really hearing, I love that. We know the literacy stuff. In a sense, we can learn all of that, but actually possibly the place where the real opportunities are is the solutions. And so that example there, if I'm a parent in a rural area, what climate transition would mean to me is I actually might have a bus to get to the nearby school rather than having to go in the car, even if it's a fairly short distance. So that's a great...
4.8 kilometers is, you know, it's a rule that came in probably the 60s and the 70s when roads were quieter, but it's a silly rule right now, and it completely jars against climate change, you know.
Yeah, great example. Thanks, Seamus. And just continuing in the same order, so how about for you, Claire? What would be something that comes to mind as a real opportunity or a positive of climate transition for all of us in rural areas?
Yeah, well, I suppose focusing again on the circular economy in particular, there's a real huge potential for job creation right across rural areas, and there already are a lot of jobs in rural areas. For example, the Community Resources Network, where I used to work with, they collect data every year on current jobs in, for example, charity retail, reuse, you know, furniture workshops and so on. There are over 800 at the moment, plus an additional 820 training positions. So that's your 2 schemes, rural social scheme, wage subsidy scheme, community employment and community services program. So all of these ways to help people access the job market who might not otherwise have it. And then there are over 8,500 volunteers working in this area. So an absolutely huge reach into communities, which is so important. And all of this is recognised in the excellent Rural Future Policy document, as Minister O'Brien pointed out. And I suppose the reason why, you know, the circular economy and kind of these reuse and repair activities particularly suited to this area is because it's about keeping our goods in circulation really as locally as possible. And it involves a huge range of different skill types, from you know, repair skills to retail to research to forklift driving. You know, it's across the board, handling products and returning them to the market. So there really is great kind of job potential in it, and it also has great social impact. So for example, social enterprises are very involved in this area, providing, you know, reuse and refurbishment services. And also help to raise funds or provide goods at low cost. For example, over lockdown last year, there was an organisation called Tech to Students set up that took donations of laptops and refurbished them and gave them to students who didn't otherwise have access to that technology. So can be really important in supporting people on low incomes. And then there's the economic impacts, which are about resilience. So we all know that we're facing some weird supply chain shortages this Christmas, where we might not be able to buy certain toys or books and all of this kind of thing that was in the papers last weekend. With this area, we already have the products in the economy. By keeping them in circulation, you know, we can access the products that are already there, or sometimes improved through upcycling or refurbishment and so on. So lots of opportunity there. And like, there's also, you know, it's a really exciting time at the moment, because not only is all that opportunity there, but there are more and more funds coming through. So we've seen from our Rural Future, again, you know, a focus on town centre regeneration, use of vacant spaces, which makes better use of our existing buildings and potentially provides, you know, spaces for workshops, for repair hubs. There's supports for social enterprises coming through. There's more community services program schemes coming through. The bike upcycling was one recently rolled out as well. And more of this would be fantastic, you know, supporting climate action through community services program, for example. There are grant schemes through the Department of Environment and community foundations. There's lots kind of there, new measures coming through to really help support growth in this area.
Wow, it just feels like there are boundless opportunities in ways. Certainly the ones you share there sound very attractive to me. And the thing I got also was this sense that you mentioned at the beginning of the diversity of working roles, job roles. I kind of feel, yeah, having, you know, gone through half of, I guess, a working career, it becomes very, it all looks the same, currently sitting behind a computer, and actually to use our hands to actually upcycle something and bring something of one's own uniqueness or creativity is actually could be a very satisfying kind of work. So thanks a lot, Claire. And how about for you, David, and then anything in terms of the real opportunities or positives that you would see?
Yeah, I think the work we've been doing with communities through the local authorities has really kind of brought it home to us how important it is to create the vision. And I think the broader vision around this transition, that we're moving to a situation where more our economic development, our social well-being, and the environment are more in balance. And I think that's a vision we can all get behind. And then we start looking at the challenges that they present. But all of these challenges in making that transition presents opportunities for enterprise to develop to meet those challenges. And I see Helen McInerney is on the call from the Western Development Commission, who published a very good report earlier this year on decarbonising the region. And they focused on 3 particular areas. The first one being on retrofit. And Rob mentioned the huge targets we have, the 500,000 houses to retrofit. by 2030. So there's a huge demand for skilled labor, more sustainable material, and even new technologies to address that. And by way of a practical example, I was talking to one of the local authorities here in the region last week who could not get a contractor to tender this year to retrofit 20 social housing buildings. So there's a huge gap in the market there. In the area of travel, so we're talking about new modes of travel, new ways of doing things. So there's the opportunities in the construction and maintenance side of new active travel infrastructure, car and bike sharing enterprises, for example, and then all the services that are needed to back up those new technologies. And even in the area of avoiding travel and the opportunities maybe to build stronger communities around remote working hubs, and then businesses built up around those to support those facilities. The circular economy, as Claire has mentioned, huge opportunities there to boost the economy. And even when you look, or if businesses start to look at what part of their supply chains are going to be impacted by climate change, there's an opportunity here to look at the circular economy and leverage that those multiple benefits that can provide. They could produce or create new industry around the circular economy, but it's also meeting an interruption in that supply chain as well. And then the area of renewables, particularly in the rural community, there's opportunities here for communities to invest and develop renewable schemes, which brings money into that rural community, but I think more nationally provides security of supply and makes us less vulnerable to changing oil prices, and helps us meet the overall targets as well. And then I think from the changes in the climate itself, there will be opportunities for some sectors such as tourism, particularly in the short to medium term, where we can attract national and international tourists that might be trying to escape the extreme heat waves around the place. But again, we need to plan for those increased numbers and protect those amenities, particularly in rural areas that those tourists will be coming to see. So huge opportunities on the enterprise side, but I think if we add that with the co-benefits of cleaner air, healthier, more balanced lifestyles, along with stronger, more connected communities, I think that vision is for me the more powerful message.
Thank you, David. I think that's come out really clearly, and particularly there's so many opportunities, particularly at the economic level, and for us all then as workers and citizens in rural areas. I wonder if we could maybe move into this, what you just touched on at the end there, David, around communities. And this has come up already in different responses, but they obviously have a big role to play. Seamus had said at the beginning about, communities want to actually be leading that change. How can we actually do that? How can that be realized? Or, is there a better way to share stories of kind of successful community climate or green projects with others? And maybe I'll just come back to you, David, first. We'll just sort of change the order. If there's something more you could say to expand on the community theme.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of studies and a lot of examples out there where, community engagement, particularly the local communities, do enhance that effective decision making. And I think if they're part of developing the solutions, it leads to more long-term impact. And I think as well, it's fair to say all communities are different and are at different stages of understanding and addressing climate action. So I think the initiatives like the National Dialogue, where we get in and understand what the concerns are and the issues are for each local community. And again, I would say the local authorities with their network have a strong role to play here. There's initiatives, as Seamus said, I think we kind of know what we have to do, or the technologies are there, particularly like, for example, in retrofit, we know what we have to do. We need to figure out how we do that, how we can mobilize the community and link them with the funding and the supports that are there. And initiatives like the decarbonised zones that are being run by the local authorities, where each local authority would have nominated a decarbonisation zone within their county or city that will effectively be a living lab, a test bed for how we can work collectively, all stakeholders, the community, enterprise, local authorities and state agents, how we can work together to deliver on this. And I think there'll be learnings from that that can be shared across our communities. And you know, there'll be mistakes made along the way, but that's the place to make them, because it is a substantial challenge. And as I say, everyone is going to be different. So initiatives like that, I think, will help develop the solutions.
Thank you, David. And just say there's an interesting reflection there from Kieran, just in the chat, saying we also need to consider at least 3 types of communities, so of place, of our locality, but also of interest, and also virtually. And I can see for myself, living in a rural area, being in those 3 cross-cutting communities, if not more. So maybe we'll come back around. So to you, Claire, just the same thing about the role of communities, how that could be realised, and also whether there's more that could be done at the government level or at the local level to kind of support communities to really be, you know, creating climate positive projects.
Yeah, I mean, so many reuse and repair activities are driven by local communities and are in local communities even now. There are wonderful, you know, examples from, you know, activities run by one single volunteer. There's a Carrickmacross Toy Library, which is a lending library for toys up in Monaghan. The Cloth Nappy Library Ireland, which is actually a national campaign, runs on volunteers around the country, sending out, you know, cloth nappy kits so you can try them out. So they're all really, you know, local community activities in the place, maybe,
yeah.
When you define community as the place. And there's lots of community of interest around circular economy as well, lots of ways to connect into that. There are other activities like repair cafes, which unfortunately have been a bit difficult to get going because of insurance issues. But, you know, charity shops are often set up by communities as well. So there's a huge number of ways to even start really small in communities with these kinds of activities. And as I said, there are lots of great supports coming through. Hopefully the Community Climate Action Programme will also support these kinds of initiatives, but Community Foundation Ireland already has a fund for circular economy as well, which is fantastic, and can see, you know, different scales of activities, which is what we need. I suppose when you talk about, you know, what can government do, you know, it's about how do we make this as easy as possible, as accessible as possible, and as affordable as possible. So it's about, you know, these small grants that get things going in communities, help people to set up projects and ideas, and then also, you know, how do we support, for example, social enterprises with community services program schemes to be able to grow their, you know, work, and how do we maybe look at different ways of taxation, maybe in the longer kind of term, changing how we apply VAT to repair, or maybe removing VAT from certain activities as well. So lots of different ways. And just to say, I suppose the Rediscovery Centre has set up what's called a Circular Economy Academy, because we also need to be working on skill building, as has already been mentioned a few times, in this area particularly as well. And that's to really try and support community groups and social enterprises to set up these new activities in this area. And one of the things that's come out of that is actually a paint reuse schemes. There's now about 5 or 6 groups around the country working on paint reuse through local development companies or just, you know, small kind of initiatives.
Wow. I mean, I really just get first of all, just the sense of there is so much already. All these types of projects are being driven by community. I'd say there is maybe something about continuing to raise awareness. I hadn't heard about the Cloth Nappy Library, but I may not be in that. There could be a community of interest as well, which I don't belong to as a non-parent, but it's just, I like to hear about these things, but I hear the main thing you're saying is just make it really easy and accessible for others to do the same, and then also have support for skill building, you know, as we develop and we get captured by this desire, then let's help us build our skills to act on it. So thanks so much, Claire. And then maybe coming back around to you finally, Seamus, on the same theme around communities, and maybe also what supports or is needed to help that really thrive and flourish. Oh, yeah, you're on mute.
Yeah. Yeah, I would, Ali, I would really talk about the capacity, and I really welcome that information given this morning at this on capacity funding, because it is all about capacity in communities. And even though communities have great sense of what they want to do and they really get excited, but in the modern era of governance and the modern era of management, we really have to supply resources in terms of capacity. And can I give you an example, something worth looking at, because it connects as to how we would deliver social enterprise schemes and similar initiatives. In the 90s, there was, if you remember, under unemployment, there was the various unemployment programs that were the SES and then the CE schemes, etc. And in those early days, because I remember being part of it, there was massive training provided to local community leaders. Because look, we're born with lots of talents, but we're not born necessarily to be the local leader in an initiative. Let's call it a local climate change or community initiative or a local transition initiative. And the FOSS at that stage gave tremendous capacity to these local leaders. And as a result, it turned the rural, certainly, landscape upside down, and in a positive way, because in every little village and every little townland, there was a FOSS sign, there was a FOSS activity. And I'd love to see a similar approach here brought right down to ground level, because even if we supply funding, which I think that we will, I hope, through, let's say, setting up energy cooperatives, or let's say setting up rural circular economy programs, or setting up other types of, let's call it, initiatives in this area, we need local leaders to manage that and to do it in a way that allows the initiative to get respectability, to get to convince everybody that this is actually a really good idea. And I think I'd love to see the social, or I'd love to see the capacity money going in this area, because I think that's what will make it work or will not. And as I said, Ali, and sorry to labor on this, the modern era, as you know, we do need proper governance all the time, and with all of the issues that affect local voluntary groups in terms of governance in the media, etc., there is a reluctance out there. So I think we should tackle that. And as I said, I welcome the funding that's coming in that direction.
Wow, thank you, Seamus, and thank you for really underlining that. We talked about skills building, and then also we could call it capacity building, and capacity building for leadership. And I really resonate with that myself. I've sort of been in that field, but also been in a lot of voluntary organizations, and now working a lot in the community sector. It's kind of, it's almost, there's so much passion, but then it actually can be destroyed in a sense if there's a, you know, if that caring leadership that's going to hold the group and help it thrive isn't present. So I'm absolutely with you, and I can see comments in the chat there. I saw Michelle Murphy from Social Justice Ireland, and you were saying the same thing. It's absolutely crucial at a community level, and to make sure no group and no community is left behind. So that sounds like an important theme. And also, just to say, I had a comment there that I forwarded on from Joe Lowe, also just back on the other aspect of funding. We need funding for capacity building, but also funding for the projects themselves. And there is funding there, but sometimes it can be kind of locked up in a lot of red tape. And I recently facilitated for a new fund, actually in inner city Dublin, but it had the simplest ever sort of application process to really try and remove every possible barrier to any community leader or group who wanted to apply. So opportunities there. So yeah, I just want to maybe just a little sort of shift into a particular or sort of more specific theme that's really relevant for us, all of us, maybe not myself personally, my role, but living in rural communities, which is, and I'm going to put this one to you, Seamus, which is that if we really take a key role in our areas here, let's say in farming and agriculture, you know, if for workers in that and leaders in that sort of livelihood, you could feel that your way of life is really being threatened by climate adaptation, or that there's a kind of heavy targeting of that particular job role, that job profession, and the rest of us in society are not really having that much sort of impact or scrutiny. So what would you say to all of our fellow farmers, agricultural leaders, to reassure them about that this is a whole of a society challenge and what the opportunities might be?
I think, Ali, first to say that we run the National Rural Network along with 3 others in terms of delivering the Rural Development Programme for Europe and Ireland, and we just publish various things that happen. And one thing that comes across is that farmers probably don't get the credit they should get in terms of the work they do in bringing climate change initiatives right inside the farm gate. There is a lot of activity, and that really needs to be promoted and understood by everybody, because they are trying very hard. Equally, the talk of the national herd is causing enormous worries and fears. And again, it's the fear, as I said at the beginning, and I don't want to overplay this, but it is real, and it's many of the smallholders, and we have a smallholder structure in Irish farming, are really worried because they do have small beef units, you know, they rely on the subsidies, etc., and they don't know how they're going to make that change happen. And even when you look at land, I think that was mentioned earlier on in one of the presentations, unfortunately, you can only make some land do some things. Not all land can produce plants or crops, and you're stuck with grazing, and yet the beef herd might be too high and all of that. I've always said that this is a bigger than just this discussion, and I know farmers would welcome a serious, almost, I'd call it summit, to look at how farming needs to change, because it does need to change, to really look at how that is going to be managed by farmers inside the farm gate, and to include them in the solutions. And it's a very big subject, Ali, and I can tell you now, there is huge fear in the rural area in terms of agriculture and what is coming down the line.
Thank you, Seamus. When you talk of the, you know, I'd put in the question, you know, how can we share that this is really a whole of society challenge? But when you talk of the summit, I was starting to envision, of course, this gathering really is all of us. It would be the farmer, it would be us as citizens, it would be us in the governance, the government. We're all a part of this. And that, I was imagining that summit could have representations of every group there. It isn't just up to the farmers, but they're certainly, you know, having to respond, and they shouldn't have to respond on their own. So yeah, thank you. I think I'm going to start to bring our conversation to an end, and maybe put a final question as we close this part of the discussion, this part of the forum, and maybe sort of bring 2 things together, which are certainly close to my heart as well. But it's just maybe just, and almost to sort of step back slightly, is just the sense that why we're doing this climate transition is certainly something that is felt keenly by many of us. And I'd say one group in our society is our young people. You know, some of the greatest activists and actors in this and voices for it have been amongst the young. And of course, they're the ones that are really going to be experiencing the impacts of any decisions and choices and actions that we make or don't make. So maybe just a final question around, you know, how can we all feel that urgency that our young people are sharing, and how can we act in a way that truly is going to secure their future, not just in 2030, but in many decades beyond, for themselves, for their own children and their own grandchildren. So maybe just this urgency of our youth and the future for them. How can we really help? What do we need to have in our minds now and in our actions? And I'll start with you, David, and we'll go around that way.
Yeah, it's a tough one, given with all the pressures we have in our day-to-day lives. Just to bring it home, well, yeah, like climate change is not a distant threat. It is happening now, and as Rob pointed out, we've a 1 degree increase in this country, just under 1 degree, and that has, you know, brought severe storms, flooding, sea level rise, and that's what we're looking at. and that will have huge impacts on our day-to-day, and particularly on the next generation. And when I say the next generation, it is the young that are already in our schools today. And when we talk about adaptation, there's only so much we can adapt to. And I would say mitigation is probably the best form of adaptation, you know, to reduce our emissions and stop locking us into this need to adapt. And Rob also mentioned climate refugees, and I suppose people think about people from Africa leaving their countries because they can no longer survive down there. But, you know, we're going to have displaced communities in our own country from temporary displacement from flooding, but particularly around sea level rise and coastal erosion. So this is, we need to get into our heads, this is serious. There's no opt-in or opt-out here. And I like to use the analogy of a marathon. That's what we're on. But the starting gun, you know, went a few hours ago, and we're still warming up on the start line. And the longer we leave it, the more difficult it is going to be. And some of us, you know, may not get to the finish line. So we need to seriously look at this. And I know Seamus addressed the agricultural sector, huge emitter for us, but we have to work with all sectors. We don't want to pit sectors against each other. But every sector has to come to the table with, firstly, to accept that change is needed. And you know, that's the starting point, and then we can work together to figure out how to make that change happen. But yeah, for me, it's moving climate action from an add-on to be the foundation of how we do things into the future.
Thank you, David. This image of the marathon, the gun already went off a number of hours ago, but we're still kind of in the warm-up mode. That doesn't work, does it? So thank you for sharing that. Claire, over to you. This is the final question around the urgency of our youth and what we should be doing now, how we can take that view.
Yeah, I think one thing we probably need to be more mindful, those who work in the circular economy, is about how we communicate and how we need to be much clearer about what we mean by all of these terms and all this jargon as well. And I can see one of the comments there, can we bring information to the citizen at the high street level in a safe and trusted manner? So we absolutely need to work on that and give better examples of what we mean, reuse and repair and all these things, what they really are. Making your own Halloween decorations from old cardboard boxes, whatever, you know, is relevant to the time. So, and one thing I was reading in the paper last weekend about how we all as humans apparently have a kind of future optimism bias. So we tend to see the future more positively than it really is going to be, maybe, which kind of surprised me. I thought we were naturally more pessimistic creatures, but one suggestion was that, you know, we need to make it kind of more fun and inclusive to kind of feed into that optimism bias. So how do we combine sort of creative arts, and the role of arts is really important. And, you know, the what was it called? The Creative Climate Fund recently really highlighted that. And, you know, bring a kind of overall positive messaging. And I suppose through the Rediscovery Centre, we try and do that kind of combination of artists and scientists and, you know, crafts people to try and like get that across. So maybe there's some opportunities there.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, and I remember now there was, I think Rob spoke to this in his presentation as well around the arts, and it was piquing my interest. But so I hear what you're saying is this natural kind of optimism bias about the future blinds us in a sense that we can't accept, we don't want to accept the reality. So perhaps with our artists, with our creators, it could become it could be presented in a way that is less, we resist less, and therefore we can actually engage and act. Thank you so much. And finally, over to you, Seamus, your thoughts on how we get captured by the youth urgency and protect their future.
Yeah, I'm really glad this is being recorded, because I think there's some great ideas even coming across the chat line as well, and I think we need to capture those. I think I'm going back to the basics here. I think there is a lot of positives here. Young people are already very clear something needs to be done, and these are young rural people as well. So there's a lot of people saying we know what's coming and we know the change is massive. And for whether you're in farming, whether you're living in a rural area that's maybe poorly served transport-wise, or whether, you know, jobs and all of that, working from home, the solutions are already kind of there, floating around, clashing into one another sometimes. And I really am saying that the roadmap for each local area through the local authority perhaps needs to be really set out. But there's some big questions that need to be resolved at cabinet level, and they need to be done very fast. But at local level, look, deliver good capacity supports, start getting younger people and more involved, and start finding simple solutions. As I said, a simple thing could have been in the budget with the school transport. It's so simple, it doesn't cost a lot. It would have been a major signal to rural communities that actually we are really doing something, and we need to get those things right. So build the local capacity, get the communities involved, start initiatives like the Circular Economy and all the other initiatives that have been put forward here today, and probably more of these town hall kind of meetings whenever we can meet in person. We really need to get round talking about and putting out roadmaps as to what we're going to do as a household next.
Wow. Thank you, Seamus. Thank you so much. And yeah, we're really, I think from all of you also this bringing everyone to the table, that we have to come and communicate all together, maybe just as we're doing here. And this could be the start of many, many conversations and actions like this. And thank you also for your call to what's needed, including coming from the cabinet, that would really support communities to act on that potentiality that's there. So with that, I would like to bring our panel conversation to a close, and just to say thank you so much to our three leaders who really contributed to this. I found it incredibly rich. It was an honor to get to pose those questions to you and to get to navigate this together. And as I say, I hope we will be doing this more times, and also many actions coming from this. So with this, I'm just going to say thank you and take down off the online stage our three speakers from today. So that was David Mellett, Claire Downey, and Seamus Boland. Thank you so much to all of you. And with that, I will end this first section of our forum together.